I recently released a tutorial which was a adaptation of a Photoshop tutorial about writing, making it look like you're writing in the sand. In that tutorial I had to sort of also make the sand background and then sort of add the writing to it. Now this one I'm going to start with a photograph of a beach scene, so I don't have to sort of make the sand, and also you get the added advantage of this wave. And also the way of doing the text is slightly different. Some parts of it are the same, but it just goes to show that there's more than one way to make an image. Now this is an adaptation of an Elements tutorial, so I went with this one because Elements is a lot closer, I think, with some of the features that you can get in Affinity Photo than some of the features that you get in a Photoshop tutorial. So I thought it would be a lot easier to get to. So whether you use this image, which is I got from Pixabay.com, and I will add a link to this in the description of this video, or you use your own image, quite where you add the shadows and the highlights is really up to you. A lot of it depends on where you think the sun is coming from. I may not have got this 100% correctly, but I've sort of got the shadows sort of the inside of the writing, the shadows are on the right, whereas like you've got the shadows on the left, and the highlights are sort of up around the top of the text. But so don't necessarily have to stick to my adaptations. If you think your light source is coming from a different direction, you can sort of make the settings how you want. So let me close this down, and we'll start with the plain background image. So the first thing I'm going to do is to select the text tool, and then I'm going to open up the character panel. Now this version they used Comic Sans. We'll just start typing that, Comic Sans MS font, and I'm going to start with 144 points, but this will change slightly, and I will also be using bold. So once I'm happy with that, and the colour, it doesn't really matter about the colour, but I'm going to leave it as black. So I'm just going to click somewhere on here where I want the text to go, and then just start typing whatever phrase that you want to be writing in the sand. So I will leave it like that at Affinity Photo. So I'm going to come to the Move tool, and then I'm just going to resize and reposition this. So first of all, I'm going to sort of twist it round by using this handle up here where the icon will turn to double-sided arrows. Just click and twist it, or rotate it, whichever you want to call it, and I'll just do a little bit of fine tuning where I come back, and then I'm going to resize it. So I'm going to hold down the Control button, Command on a Mac, and just drag it out to make that a bit bigger. Yes, I think that'll do. I'll leave it as that. I don't need this character panel now, I can get rid of that. So next what I want to do is to select the text. Now you can do this from the select menu and come up to, as long as this layer is highlighted, you can come to select selection from layer, so that will now all be selected. You just press Ctrl and D to unselect that, or what you can do is hold down the Control key and click on the icon for the layer, and that too will select all the text. So you can do that either way. So what I'm going to do now is highlight the background layer, because it is a selection from this layer that I want to make, not the letters itself as such. So I'm now going to just press Ctrl and J, and that will make a duplicate layer just of the selected area. If I turn off that layer and the bottom layer, as you can see, it's just selected that text. So I'll turn back on the bottom layer. I'm not going to bother with the text layer. I don't need that anymore because it's now all on this layer here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Ctrl and D to get rid of that selection, and then I'm going to click on the FX icon, which is down here, which will open up the layers effects, and I'm going to put a tick into Bevel and Emboss, and then click on the words Bevel Emboss just to bring up all the options. Like I said before, you can change the settings to suit your particular image or your particular tastes. But for this layer we are sort of trying to get the shadows of this particular bit of text that I have written here. So I'm going to leave it on pillow as the type. I'm going to make the radius 0.1, and I'm going to be changing the depth. Now at the moment the depth and the radius are linked, so I just need to click on this chain here to unlink them, and I'm going to make the depth of this 19.5, and I'm going to push the soften right the way up as far as it will go to 20. Now this next part here is the azimuth and elevation. Basically we want it to be sort of coming somewhere down here in the bottom. You can just click on the circle and move it around wherever you want. So wherever your sun, where you think the sunlight is coming from, will depend on where you place this white dot. Now I did this on minus 122.9 and an elevation of 0. Unlike the previous video that I made on this, I'm not going to be making any alterations to the highlight and shadows. I'm going to leave them as they are, and then I'm just going to close that panel. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add a levels adjustment, and to do this I'm going to click on this half black and white circle down here and come up to levels. Now I'm not going to make any alterations at the moment. I'm just going to shut it down, and then I'm going to click and drag this layer down into and make it a child of this background layer here, and when I get a blue line coming just to the edge of the icon, I know that it is going to be a child of this layer. So just click and drag this down. Hopefully you can see that blue line there, and when I let go, that is now a child of that layer and will only affect that layer. But I'm not going to make any alterations yet. That is going to come later. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rename this. I'm going to call this one Shadows, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this whole little group here. So I'll just right click and come down to duplicate, and I'm going to rename this group Highlights, and then I'm going to drag this layer down so it's underneath the shadows layer, and this time the blue line needs to go all the way across to the other side, so you know it's not becoming part of this group, it's going to be separate still. So I'm just going to click and drag this down, so now the highlights layer is below the shadows layer. But now I am still highlighted on the highlights layer, and it has copied over the effects. I can click on the effects icon on that particular layer and we can make some alterations to this one. So I'm going to leave it set on pillow. I'm just going to increase the radius to 0.2, and I'm going to alter the depth down quite a bit to 2.2. I'm going to leave the soften on 20 pixels, and the azimuth I'm going to change to -164.2, and the elevation is going to be 23.4. Again, I'm going to leave these highlights and shadows section as they are, and I'm now going to close that effects panel. Right, so what I need to do now is we are just going to nudge this particular highlights layer just slightly off of the layer above it. Now I'm going to move it up and to the left, but you may want to move yours up and to the right or down. But to do this, I'm just going to use the arrow keys, just clicking them, pressing them one at a time. You'll be moving the layer just by sort of 1 pixel at a time. So first of all, I'm going to press the up arrow about 4 times, and then the left arrow 4 or 5 times. So you can see, hopefully you can just see there's now a slight difference in position of this highlights layer to the shadows layer that is above it, and you can hopefully see it's slightly lighter. So I will leave that where it is at the moment. I can always come back and just tweak it slightly if I want to. Right, so I'm going to click and highlight the shadows layer, and I'm going to right click that and duplicate it again, and I'm just going to rename this one Sand. So basically this bottom layer will be just adding a bit to the highlights, this next one will be adding to the shadows, and the sand layer will be just altering the colour of the sand inside the letters, as it's going to be slightly darker and sort of hopefully make it look like it's going in to the lighter sand above it. So because we've already added the levels layer to the very first layer we made and have duplicated it, each one of these now has their own levels adjustment. So we can now start using those adjustments. So what we're going to do is this top layer here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the blending mode from normal to lighten, and I'm just going to click on this little arrow here so I can see the levels adjustment, and I'm going to double click it so the levels adjustment opens, and I'm going to move the black slider all the way over so it's just starting to touch where the pixels are starting to build up in this histogram. So I'm going to just close that one. Then I need to open the highlights layer and the histogram for that. Double click on that, the levels adjustment I should say. Open up the adjustment, and this time I'm going to bring the white layer. Now you can either come up to the start of where the pixels are, or you can bring it quite a bit into that pixel stack to sort of make that much brighter, and then close that. I've brought this over to about 80%, and then highlight the actual layer itself, and then we're going to add a bit of blur to this. So we're going to have filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and so we're just sort of blurring the highlights in the background here. I've got mine set on 4 pixels. You may want to make it less or make it more, and I'll click apply. Again, if you, while you're on this layer and on the move tool, if you want to just nudge it a little bit further, you can use the arrow keys just to keep nudging it and moving the highlights around a bit, but I'm going to leave mine where it is. And then I'm going to come to the shadows layer and its level adjustment, and I'm double click on that, and this time I'm just going to be using the gamma slider, and I'll just move it to the right just to make it a bit darker. It's not having too much effect at the moment. Oh, I'm not giving it time to catch up, sorry. Right, I'm going to go to about 1.24 just to make it slightly darker than the surrounding sand. So hopefully that now looks like it's digging into the sand. Looks better, I must admit, in the letters up here than maybe the letters down this end. So now close that. So the last thing I'm going to do is, let me just shut all these. And I'm going to highlight the top sand layer, hold down the shift key and click on the highlights layer so it highlights all 3 of those groups, and I'll right click and I will group them all together, and now all of that is one group. I could resize, reposition it as is if I wanted to, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce the opacity so it's not quite so harsh, down to maybe 60%, I think 61, that's okay. So basically that is the finish of that. You may want to also, depending on your picture, maybe use a perspective tool and sort of warp it so it looks like it's going off into the distance, but I'm fairly happy with that end result as it is, so I'm going to stop there. So thank you for watching. Hopefully, I'm still trying to find a good one, tutorial to convert that also has the little grains of sand around the letter where like as if you'd drawn it in the sand, but I haven't found one of those to convert yet. But this is the end of this one, so goodbye.